Tēnā koutou katoa, ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou. Ki ngā whānau no ngā haue whā, ki o tātou maunga whakahi, kai te mihi, tēnā tātou katoa. So, kia ora everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to speak, and I guess I'd really like to acknowledge also the Minister here for Whānau Ora, tēnā koe Minister, the GPL Board, the taumata, and of course Helen as well. And if I've forgotten anybody, it's because I can't see you out there anyway, which is probably just as well. But kia ora. I'm actually here to sort of try and talk to, I kept thinking about what am I going to talk about, and I feel sometimes like I've been talking about this forever, but I do want to encourage people as, you know, in some ways we don't have the luxury not to talk about these things. So these were about, you know, what were the dreams, what are the things that are going to enable Whānau Ora to flourish? Because Whānau Ora and your capacity to act in a purposeful way is within a particular context, and it's the context of New Zealand, and it's the context of what is pretty much a whole lot of inequality. So what we have here, which people will be really familiar with this image, you know, what we have here is, you know, this is about equality. This is equality, and this is something that doesn't work for us. This is what justice looks like, but this is what liberation means, and the taking away from that, and the ability for whānau to believe in themselves that we can actually do something, in spite of often not just, if we're not only working in this context, which is all about, you know, and I think we're quite free now to talk about the issue of racism rather than unconscious bias. There is a lot of conscious, very conscious bias out there. That means that we've been in a position, we've been bred as a people to be passive. We've been bred as a people that when we have a problem that we've had to defer to agencies and look to government to try and sort that. What that's done is undercut our capacity to actually look after each other and to do the things that we do normally. Now, one of the things I've also been thinking about for ages, as part of Ngāi Tahu, and Mark will remember this, is right from settlement, we knew that relationships were really important, and everyone talks about relationships. And I guess I'm here to say, actually, it's not all about relationships, because we get caught up in relationships that aren't about our business. So for the last 20 or so years, Ngāi Tahu has been really wedded to the notion of we have to have relationships with everybody, and that means a seat at their table. Now, when you get a seat at their table, you come in and you have their conversation with them. And we spend an inordinate amount of time and our energy in somebody else's conversation who aren't even prepared to have our conversation. So I've been a really loud proponent about we do need to get off other people's boards. We do need to have our own ones. When we hear about equity, we hear about it as if it's some sort of thing out there that has an impact on us, when equity is really about the fact that we don't receive the same citizenship rights as everybody else. This is about discrimination. We can't just keep talking about equity, we have to say that there's discrimination in the system that keeps producing the type of negative data that we hear about it. And like we heard earlier, nobody's talking about all the good things that we're doing. Nobody's also saying to us that we actually have the ability to build the structures that create the context in which we work with whānau. We really have to move past this notion of Māori responsiveness, and we do have to focus on the fact that we're not treated as citizens like everybody else. If the aim is not mana motuhake, then we're not going to get anywhere. And this is, you know, and even for myself, and I realised that, you know, there were things that you're wedded to when you're young because you believe they'll work. And it's okay to go, hey, oops, that was a bit of a failure, it's not going to work. Things won't work for Māori when we constantly are reliant on both Crown agencies, but also other services, particularly mainstream services, to provide the solutions for us. The aim always has to be about mana motuhake, and for mana motuhake to be realised, we need a minimum of having our civic entitlements recognised. So there we have it's about civic entitlement. We've got to stop imagining and accepting the fact that we don't have them. We've got to constantly challenge. We've got to constantly believe the fact that we have a right to say these systems aren't working for us and hey, your system's racist. Unless you can actually show the reasons why that these Crown agencies have not delivered to Māori and are incapable of delivering to Māori, we're always going to be in their conversation about how we make them better, rather than building ourselves to create the type of institutions that we need for mana motuhake. We also, no one's going to argue that cultural connectivity is incredibly important for whānau, but it needs to be authentic cultural connectivity. We can't keep participating in what are pseudo arrangements for connection when it's not something that moves past the transactional relationship with people. The authentic cultural connection, the fact that we need to rebuild those and that we need to recognise I'm going to put it out there, guys, we can be our own worst detractors. The whole tall poppy syndrome, the whole thing that happens around that. If there was one thing I learned over the last 30 years is you've got to work against all the structural stuff that impacts and limits our capability to act like purposeful citizens. We've also got to be really, really critical of ourselves around the fact that we have too many people who say they do want a space at that table. I'm in the process now of saying to Ōtākau Runanga, we have got to not sign that MOU with the DHB. We cannot continue to sit at their table, when we know that particularly Māori men in the Eastern Southland District have an independent life expectancy of 52. Now that's the national one is 56. So Māori are living longer. We're living longer, guys, but what we're doing is we're living with less dependence because we don't get all those entitlements that we should have over our growing years, over our lifespan that allow us to be independent when we're in our 70s. So yes, guys, you're living longer, but you're going to be dependent. And that worried me because I thought, is it going to be Māori women looking after you? So scraping off some of our independence as well. And for that to happen, we really do need those authentic cultural connections with each other. So we know that the Ministry of Social Development and that do recognise that cultural connections are good, but it's not enough to have someone greet you in Māori, put you into an organisation that isn't Māori and do all sorts of things like that. That's not authentic and it's not going to last. That's a transaction. And that's a transaction that the mainstream's been very good at clipping on our backs. But the type of cultural authenticity and the connection that happens when you are with your own people is something that lasts past the 12-month contract, because you will be instantly invited into a much bigger whānau than what you have yourself. So I'm not going to give up on the notion of mana motuhake here, and I know it's not going to be easy, and I know it is sometimes much easier for us to work in the way we do. But unless that's your aim, then as Māori services, we're at risk of reproducing the types of outcomes that our whānau already receive. Here. So I take these pictures of my moko with me when Tā Mason said about future. So this is my future focus. I make sure I have my moko with me. So this is my oldest one, and all my moko were given whakapapa names so that they will never forget where they came from, because you'll recognise the name. So this is my oldest one, and she's Te Atawhiua. And one of the things when I was thinking about mana motuhake, I looked at, and I've been really lucky that I've had a chance and to look at what's happening overseas. And this is one of the things for people to remember. Don't accept the fact when Crown agencies say to you there's no evidence. Don't accept their evidence, Because when you look at the research that underpins a lot of the way that service development occurs, you'll find these wee disclaimers at the bottom of this international research that say they haven't worked with Indigenous people. We can't keep using research that's not about us. It's about who is this going to benefit, and it's not us. So I've looked for probably years. I looked over in Canada back in 2001, and I think when they were at Manitoba, and what they were doing there in the child welfare space there. I also looked at the Harvard, what they call the Harvard Indian Project, and also what they're doing up in Kamloops in Canada. And one of the things that came out of that is mana motuhake, sovereignty matters. If you don't have sovereignty, if you don't feel like a sovereign being and replete with your citizenship entitlements, then it is going to be a struggle for you. We know that leadership matters, and leadership in all forms. And I said this, I remember saying this 20 years ago at a leadership conference in Wellington, that, we get used to the big people type leadership and the, sort of big chief type leadership, which is fine. But for me, the single mother that gets out of bed every morning, that gives her kids breakfast, gets them ready for school, those are the leaders, because they're the leaders of the next generation. And I do a shout out to all those women that do that. Now, institutions matter, and I spoke to you earlier about the fact that, try to resist being at their table, having their conversation. How do we build our own institutions? They may not have the resources that government has it now with the Crown agencies, but I'd much rather be a small kaupapa institution doing the things that we want that are focused on mana motuhake than having all those resources that come in large organisation. So institutions matter. Culture matters. And culture is really important. And this is something that we've said all the time, that must have cultural authenticity. We often get pulled into, and I remember it was probably back in the early 2000s where everybody got caught up trying to teach people in other institutions how to be culturally responsive to us. Now that doesn't work. The one thing that we know as Māori is we really respect authentic people. And I think for people who aren't Māori, I respect their culture. Just be authentic. You don't have to be me. Don't go and use my language when you're out there working with whānau, who for historic reasons that everybody in this room knows, won't have had access to their culture. It just feels like more appropriation. So culture matters, and it needs to be like connections, it needs to be authentic. This here is my grandmother's father. This is Ihai Portiki. And Ihai Portiki left Otako and went down to a small place called Kaka Point. And he set up a pa there, and that's where my grandmother and my aunties were born there. So for him, and what the research is telling, is when Native people themselves decide to take action and use their approaches, and this is a research out of Harvard, they found that they outperformed other institutions, including governmental institutions, across diverse areas as economic as well as health and social services. So this is research that I have no idea, so it's been out for the last 20 years. I have no idea why when government goes looking for research on what will work for Māori, why we keep looking at research from England, US, everywhere else, when we know that there's been some great research done on Indigenous people. And incidentally, the Harvard project actually looked at Indigenous institutions internationally. This is my grandmother, this is my tawa. And she had a really strong, she had a strong mother as well. So her mother was Eliza Portiki. And Eliza Portiki back then was she was very sort of involved in what was then called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So that was, and she belonged to the one on Rakiura. And it was interesting that she was like that. So what I recognise is that often the women in my family have this huge courage in their own convictions. So back then, my great-grandmother, Eliza, was involved in trying to get rid of that demon drink. Now, her daughter, Pani, or Fanny as she got called when she went to school, Pani here, she was one of the women that campaigned to allow women into pubs, into lounge bars. And that was because she said back then the men used to get their pay and go into the pub and they couldn't get it off them. So this was down in Bluff, and and there used to be a picture of her in a hotel in Invercargill because she campaigned to allow women to be able to go into the lounge bar, really when they were just wanting to go in there and get it. Now, she introduced new knowledge there which was different from her mother's, but it was still their outcomes that they were seeking, which were about whānau, was still the same. So we also need leaders that aren't frightened of introducing new knowledge and that propose change. So this was her. I've been told I look like her. This was her back then, and it's really amazing when you think, oh my gosh, my grandmother, she looks like something out of the Victorian era. But she had a profound impact on all her grandchildren and the work that she did. So all this, when we look at institutions matter, we thought, right, I could spend another 25 years or so working to try and change Crown institutions. Or I could say, I'll back myself and let's look at how we can set something up. So we wanted to set this up, not simply because we wanted to be in the primary care space delivering services. It was really about the fact that for whānau to be able to be purposeful and to get their civic entitlement, they do need it. We needed a place where whānau would be able to come and we could assist them to build their civic entitlement so that they act purposefully. And I always say to people, and don't get me wrong, there's a great author, Frans Fanon, who wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth, and it was all about colonisation. And, when I say I don't want to save the wretched of the earth, I truly don't. What I want to do is help build environments in which they act purposefully. So I'm not here to say, and people who do know me from years ago know I'm actually not a health person. Don't think I'm an expert in health. I always think I'm my primary background, which is around education. But I find myself in this sector doing it. But one of the things was, how do we create institutions that are built by us and owned by us? Because ownership is incredibly important. We know that. If you don't own it, if you end up just being, and I've just come back from Wellington last night, and constantly what you see is Māori responsive organisations, because they have a Māori from the community on it, or other things like that. What I look for, what I identify as a culturally authentic organisation, a kaupapa organisation, is one where it's owned by Māori. So that's incredibly important. If we don't own these things, we're not able to shape them in the way that we want them to be shaped. So this was the basis behind Te Kaika, and Te Kaika would not have been a reality. It would have still stayed in the Moemoeā region if we hadn't met the perfect storm, which was the setting up of the whānau Order Commissions and the willingness of the Ministry of Education to allow us to use the premises. But of course, as things go, in the perfect storm, you're either going to be whipped up high or you're going to be shattered on the beach. And as you're doing things like that, all the things that happen, and the reason why I say this to you is there are so many things that happened during that period, we could have walked away. It was unrelenting, and it's still unrelenting. Anybody who knows, who's trying to run a business or another type of institution, you will struggle. But I'd rather be struggling doing something that I know is about that where we're looking for mana motahaki than struggling inside systems that haven't been kind to us. So it's a struggle. I'm not going to say it was easy, but what made us able to do that was because we got that first grant for anyone else who was in the first wave of Te Pūtahitanga. We got that grant so that we were able to go. We got a certain percentage from Te Pūtahitanga. We took that and we went out and we banged on people's door and looked for co-investment. We got co-investment from the iwi, and from the university. The interesting thing about health is it's quite incestuous. It just looks at itself and its own institutions. So when I'm saying, hey guys, let's look at a new way of doing this, we can't sit here and accept the fact that of negative data that comes out about us. You know, some people should be ashamed that Māori men are only independent till they're 52 in East and Southland. You know, why isn't that a crisis? But anyway, when it was clear that we were setting up, because health is a big stakeholder, I went to see them, but they were not interested as they drown in their own deficits. They're not interested. The first things to get cut will be kaupapa providers across there. We know that the government gave them in 2013, the government increased the funding for Māori providers in the Southern District, but yet the pūtea out to those providers decreased by probably about 15%. So we know we're not a priority. As people sort of beat their breasts about equality and being kind to each other, we know we're not a priority. We've got to do this ourselves. And we've got to do it under the fear of failure. And don't be frightened to fail, because I realise, you know, over my sort of nearly 30 years, you know, I've failed probably lots of times and things. But you've got to just get back up and do it. You know, so now I talk about fast failure. Fail fast so that we can change what we're doing and do it differently. So this was what Te Kaika was all about. And the amazing thing is, none of the funding to get this up and running, in the end, on day one when we opened, it cost us $3.2 million. And none of it came out of health. You know, in spite of that. So when I say I'm not a promoter of relationships, only those relationships that advance our interests. So even though health is a huge stakeholder, I've parked them there, but I'm not going to spend my time putty around people. We just need to get on, even if it's still a struggle now when you put yourself out there into the health market. But the culture matters. Successful economies stand on the shoulders of legitimate institutions and culturally grounded, iwi-governed institutions. And we might have, you know, we're not always happy with the decisions that our hapu and iwi make, but they'll always be there. And I'd back them before I'd back anybody else. I don't get a choice, like most people. You don't get a choice about who you're related to. But the other thing is, and that's the young man in the middle is my son. Now, he was born and we didn't find out until, you know, because trying to get an assessment of your child. My background, as I said, is in health. It was actually as in educational psychology. And so part of it there, and so I knew that, and I was gutted when I realised I didn't notice my son was different. So my son is on the autism spectrum. And it took until he was 9, and then we just had to pay for it ourselves to get an assessment for him. Not that it mattered, because you don't get any funding, because people say he's high performing. He's high performing because we have known to get up at about 5:30 every morning so that we don't rush him. You know, because if I rush him, one time I did rush him and went, for God's sake, like you do when you're running out the door, and I had somebody come and complain that I was not looking after my child properly because he was upset because his mum had yelled at him. You know, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, why don't you come and tell me how you can help me? You have no idea what this is like, bringing up kids. And particularly because he wants to be like everybody else. And he wants to be, and he's good, and that's for people who know Atariki, and that's a boy Gerety, if people know him for his parents from the university. But this is them out gathering tuaki out at Otago. These are the things that they do that are normal, that were normal in my lifetime, but are not normal for a whole lot of young Māori out there. So to rebuild faith in ourselves, we do have to feel very secure about what our culture is. Don't let other people tell you what your culture is. There's a whole lot of voices out there telling our own people that they're just not Māori enough, and just, tell them to bugger off. It's not about that. So these are my two grandsons, Tūtekawa and Tauka. And Pia Ngaitahu people will know who they are. And the one thing, so the pale one, he's a little bit paler than his brother. He's a hard case, Tūtekawa, because he'll say to him, what bothers me is he's not as confident in his culture. For some reason, he's not. His younger brother, who's a wee bit darker and hair colouring at least, said to me, Tūtekawa only says he likes going to the marae because he wants to be more Māori. And that sort of broke my heart. And then when I went into his classroom that same day, and I'm looking, how you have in classroom and they have kids do images of themselves put on the wall. I'm looking for Tūtekawa and I can't find it. Then I found it. It was the one painted really brown with a moko on his chin. And I thought, but we build that in him. He's very proud. He loves to. He will always greet you in Māori. He'll always hariru. He'll do that sort of thing. But what it tells you is from a very young age, the environment out there soaks into our young people and makes them feel that they have to act in a particular way. And if that is a normal development part, let's make sure they act in our way, if nothing else. This is the last one that I'll end with, and this is my my other granddaughter. And the reason why I'm ending with her is because her name is Matahaere, and she is and Matahaere was the mother of my great-great-grandfather I showed up there. And because we don't have images of her, we have his image, but we didn't have his mother's image. So she's named after her because these are names that we don't want to forget. We don't want to forget the fact that of who Matahaere was. When we go in there, my daughter is engaged in trying to build the history around some of our women. We know that historians have recorded stories about our male tupuna, but they often don't talk about, I've always said, so what was Te Ruahikihiki's wives doing? Whatever happened to them? Where are they? And we can see through the whakapapa where they came, but what were their lives when they were doing that? One of the things I've always said to people is, you do have to have confidence in yourself. We do have to stop this. There's been this huge build-up of trust in other people to look after us, and we've actually got to take that back. We've got to say, and even if we fail, let's fail on ourselves. Don't let other people fail on that. So one of the things I've always said to my children and to my grandchildren, and they're familiar with, the one thing I want to leave for them, and as we get older we think, what's the legacy we leave for our whānau? We need to leave that footprint. We need to say that culture's the shadow that values leaves behind. You can tell what type of culture people have and what type of values they have by the decisions they make about things. And the shadow is what I've always wanted to leave for my grandchildren and for my whānau for the future. I want them to know that their taua was not frightened of failing, not frightened of speaking out and saying, hey, that's not okay, I don't want a relationship with you. I don't care if there's a specific thing in the around the treaty that says that DHBs have to have relationships with mana whenua. I don't want a relationship with you because you don't perform well. And you don't listen to us, and you don't provide a space in which we can build our own institutions. I also want to say, that we know all these things. What we often lack is the courage of our own convictions, even sometimes when we know it's wrong. We've got to be prepared to speak up. So this was all I really wanted to say for today. So kia ora, everyone.